Yeah, a very good afternoon, and thanks so much for your time. So let's clarify exactly what's going on. You're the lady in the know when it comes to all of this. So where do we stand with the J&J vaccine? I mean, first we hear they're put on hold and need to be discarded, while at the same time we're hearing that South Africa is receiving another batch of 300,000.
The batch that South Africa is receiving of 300,000 comes from batches that have been cleared, so they're not affected and not contaminated. So to take a little bit back, there is a company in Baltimore in the United States that is producing ingredients that the J&J vaccine is being made with. And in March, the FDA, their regulator, it's the equivalent of our SAPRA, our regulator, they went to the factory to see if they had good farm manufacturing practices, and they found that it was not up to scratch. And they found one batch to be contaminated and said the batch couldn't be used, but then they stopped all the production. And they said, now we want to investigate all the batches that were produced during that time. Now, our vaccines here in South Africa, the 2 million that are waiting at Aspen, in the Eastern Cape, they were produced with ingredients that were made at that factory. So the reason why we are uncertain as to whether we can release it is because the FDA needs to tell us which batches are affected and which batches are not. So in other words, which batches were made with ingredients that were contaminated and which batches were not, or maybe it's all of them. Yeah. So what's happening at the moment is, yesterday the New York Times published a story saying that the FDA found that 60 million doses can't be used. But the FDA shortly after that released its own statement and didn't mention the number. They just said there are 2 batches that can be used, but with special conditions. So the situation we are in at the moment in South Africa is that we don't know of those 2 million doses that are waiting for us at Aspen. We don't know which ones can be used and which ones can't. The 300,000 we're talking about are not from Aspen. They're not waiting there. They are vaccines that will be flown into South Africa and that were produced at the same company but not affected. And those vaccines will specifically go to teachers. They won't go to general vaccine sites.
All right. Well, I suppose that was the next question, is who will actually get the J&J vaccines? We know those over 60 mostly have been getting Pfizer so far, and healthcare workers have been getting the J&J jab. So if you can specify, and you did say teachers, they will go to teachers. So who else will be getting the J&J vaccines?
So the 300,000 J&J vaccines that will be flown in will specifically go not just to teachers, to everyone working at schools. So all school staff. But originally, as you may recall, the government procured 480,000 doses of those. But there was a expiry date of June 28, and they then reduced that number because the FDA took quite some time to come up with a decision. So for the entire past week we were waiting for the decision, and they then reduced the number because they were concerned that we wouldn't be able to use it by June 28. But what then happened after they reduced the number was that the FDA decided that the expiry date of all J&J vaccines can now be extended from 3 months to 4.5 months. And when the health department went back and said, well, can we get 480,000 doses now again? Because obviously these vaccines will now last for longer. J&J said we've got no stock left. So that's why we're only getting 300,000.
All right. And then, Mia, I suppose this is not going to help sort of our battle with the vaccine hesitancy. Already people are quite suspicious. Many people have had to be convinced to go and take these vaccines. Now, this story with possible contamination and not knowing whether the ones we have been cleared or the ones that are sitting in our factory here in South Africa, what needs to be done. How do you think this is going to affect people actually wanting to go out and get this vaccine now?
So I think we've been very unfortunate because specifically with J&J, there have been many delays that was really out of our control and out of the health department's control. You may recall when there was a pause in the Sisonke study with the relationship to very rare forms of blood clots. There was a pause for 2 weeks in that study, and now we have the situation with potentially contaminated batches. And those were very unfortunate. It's really out of our control. How will it affect people's take-up of J&J? Well, I would like to point out that one of the good things we have in our country is SAPRA, our regulator, really does make very thorough decisions. They may take long, but they make very thorough decisions. So they will not allow vaccines that are not safe and that are not effective to enter the country. I think it's really important to remember that. How will it affect people? I think the health department is going to have to really intensify its communication and its messaging, because if people are doubtful because of what has happened, the only way to help them to come on board again is to get good information to them and to get it to them in a form that they can understand it. So I think we're really going to have to step up with our messaging campaigns. Otherwise, there would likely be fewer people who take it up, because if things like these happen, then it does influence how people think about the vaccines.
But, Mia, if you do know, I mean, how does one go about testing whether the batches we do have, the ones sitting in our factory, are actually contaminated? How do you check for those? And how does that not compromise them already if we have to do tests on what we have stocked up and waiting already?
I'm not sure what we're going to do on our side, so I'm not sure what SAPRA is going to do. They may just very well evaluate data that's been given to them from the US regulator, the FDA. But in their press statement, the FDA said two things were done. One was they looked at the production facility records, and secondly, they asked the company itself to do quality testing on these vaccines. Now, I'm not exactly sure what that quality testing entails, whether you take the vaccine and analyze the ingredients. That, I think, a technical person would have to explain.
Yeah. All right. Well, and in terms of contamination, for anybody who might be, especially after what we say, we don't know how they're going to test this, what was the actual contamination? What led to this call in the first place? Just for anybody who might have missed it over the past couple of days, what was the actual issue that led them to believe that those batches were contaminated?
So this factory produced two different vaccines, ingredients of two different vaccines in the same factory, J&J and AstraZeneca. And when the batch that the FDA looked at in March was essentially thrown out, they discovered that some of the AstraZeneca vaccine's ingredients were contaminated, the J&J vaccines. So if you talk about contamination, it is contamination of ingredients of a different vaccine, and in this case, AstraZeneca.
All right, Mia Malan, thanks very much for that. That's where we're at the moment.